to the Seeds of Wellbeing podcast, Experts in the Field series, featuring people working in the field of expertise to provide support for agriculture producers in Hawaii, in the United States, and in some cases around the world. These podcasts are made possible by a grant from the University of Hawaii College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources, also known as CTAHR, and the Seeds of Wellbeing, or SOW project, and is supported by a grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and the Hawaii Department of Agriculture. Hi, Bob, Chad. Thank you for joining us on our podcast, our Seeds of Wellbeing podcast. I'd like to introduce our audience to Bob Fetsch and Chad Reznicek. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. I know it's a Czechoslovakian name, so I'm just going to call you Chad and Bob. So
that's fine. That's fine.
Sorry. Ag producers will work through the night to fix a tractor needed for harvest the next day or help birth the calf. But will they take time needed to maintain their health? It can be tempting to cowboy up and ignore things, but is that the best strategy? Let's hear from two professionals who have been working in the field of behavioral health and what we can learn from what they're doing in Colorado to help ag producers keep up with their mine maintenance. Bob, can you tell us a little bit about who you are, your expertise, and anything else you would like to share?
Sure. Well, thank you, Tao, for inviting Chad and me to talk with you today. In background, I'm the oldest of five in our family, and our family, my dad was fourth generation farmer in North Texas, and my brother is fifth generation, and his daughter and son-in-law will be a sixth generation farmer in our family in North Texas. My brother farms about 10 farms right now that he owns in North Texas. So I'm interested both from the background of being the brother and son of farmers and spending my 40 years as a career with working with all kinds of families, but especially with farm and ranch families who are highly resilient, who bounce back in spite of all kinds of setbacks and crises, etc. But they also have real challenges in working together and with stress and depression and suicide. In terms of, at least here in the mainland, their suicide rates are much higher than the national average. So I've been acutely aware of that and want to use my time and whatever skills I have in helping people to recognize the signs of high stress, anger, depression, and suicide, and to know how to make effective referrals. Is there more you want to know about my background? I'm in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies at Colorado State University. I'm with Extension. I'm the co-project director of the Colorado AgrAbility project. Chad and I are with a FRSAN grant through NIFA, National Institute for Food and Agriculture, to bring him on board, where we're expanding what Colorado AgrAbility does, and that we published 9 articles on our work there. And we found not only are we highly successful in improving the physical well-being of farmers and ranchers in Colorado and 13 other states, but also in improving their psychological well-being. And that's where Chad comes in, as he's the leader in terms of expanding our work to include the psychological well-being and addressing those issues. He's doing a great job here in Colorado, and we'll be expanding to the SRAPs in the Western region, and then with all 13 states and 4 territories in the Western region as well through another FRSAN grant. Were there other questions?
Oh, that's excellent. I'm gonna ask Chad now to sort of share your expertise, Chad, and what are you doing?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, as Bob said, for having us today. It's a real honor and delight to spend some time with you this afternoon. So yeah, my name's Chad Reznicek, and I grew up in a really small town in central Nebraska. Both my parents were raised on farms. They did not continue farming themselves, but I was able to spend quite a bit of time on my maternal grandparents' operation. They had livestock and did corn, alfalfa, soybeans. And, growing up in a town of less than 2,000 people, almost all the cultural events, seasonal activities were all sort of dictated by agriculture. Definitely picked up a lot of my values and a lot of my sense of community and sense of where we kind of fit in the world through those early experiences. Moved away from that small town and went to college and ended up as a licensed therapist. And I did that, and I've done that for 20 years. I've worked primarily with adolescents as my main clinical population, but to do that effectively with adolescents, you really need to work with the systems around them. So worked a lot with families, with community members and stakeholders around those youth, and been able to do it in northeast New Mexico in some pretty rural areas where a lot of people there trace their land back to Spanish land grants. And so that was kind of a different land constellation than what I grew up with in Nebraska. And then worked in residential settings, worked in correctional settings, and worked in home settings, going into the family homes and helping equip parents to develop skills to help prevent their kids from getting further into like system involvement with legal difficulties and whatnot. And had an opportunity, saw this position come available through CSU, and I kind of felt like after 20 years of working specifically with adolescents, I'd paid off my karmic debt for my teenage years, and I might be ready to make a shift. And also saw it as a chance to give back to the community that in the culture that gave so much to me. And so was really fortunate to be able to come on and have just thoroughly enjoyed it. I see my task and my responsibility is looking at how can we help improve access and availability of quality behavioral health services specific for farmers and ranchers. I don't think that we often view that group as an underrepresented population, but in fact, it does require some pretty significant cultural awareness and cultural competency and responsiveness in terms of being able to serve them well. And I think there's some incredible strengths and some incredible challenges within that community, and just starting to, I think, scratch the surface of what we can do. So it's kind of my task.
Oh, thank you. So I'm going to start off asking you about the strength, because you did mention quite a bit about the resiliency. And I think that's the problem solving skills is amazing among our ag community, right? When we have challenges and that mindset, that the resolve to figure out what needs to be done. But when it comes to the mind, sometimes it's really hard to figure out what's going on in the mind. And so can you share a little bit about some of the resources that you've developed to encourage our farmers and ranchers to recognize what is going on that would need further strengthening so that we can continue to be resilient? Maybe reflect on a bit of what prevents folks from identifying sometimes that, we need a little strengthening, and also identifying what could be enhanced.
And I think before I do that, I'd like to kick back to Bob for a second, because he's got this great term in this great way of describing the potential for agricultural producers to be sort of ad hoc engineers. And so, Bob, before I get into my piece, I don't know if you want to talk about in some of the problem solving that you've seen.
Yeah, working with my dad and my uncles and neighbors when I was a boy in the hayfield and the silage filling and the harvesting of wheat and all, I noticed that not only my dad, but over the years, many farmers are what I call engineers. They're engineers without the PE. They encounter a problem of some kind, and as they're driving around chiseling or cutting hay or baling or raking hay or putting up silage or harvesting their crops, they think about how to solve that problem. Whatever it is, if a calf is sick, they figure out how do I solve that problem. If a chisel broke down and needs welding, they figure it out. If a pipe is leaking, they figure it out. And so they look for concrete solutions. Most of the farmers and ranchers I've met are very concrete operational. They look at a problem and they think about it like an engineer does, like my daughter does, and my son-in-law. they're quite practical people, in which they look at solutions to problems. And where one of the problems is with that is they apply that to their couple and family issues too. Well, if my wife has a problem, then let's solve the thing, and get over it. I got to get back out in the field. So they often are not as skilled at listening patiently to their spouse or their mother or their dad, or son or daughter, as they could be. They could grow in that area many times. So because they look at it as a problem and how can we solve it and get her done. Is that what you mean, Chad?
Yeah. Thank you for that. And so the practical benefit of that is that you have this incredibly self-reliant and independent mindset. And there's this practical need. Your day is not defined by normal work hours or office hours. It's defined by the tasks at hand and where that fits into seasonal cycles. And at the end of the day, if something breaks down and you're out having to repair something at midnight, it's really on you to get that done. And so there's not many things that really hamstring farmers and ranchers, because they're so used to problem solving and constantly looking at how do we adapt? How do we change? How do we be able to get from point A to point B? And that's fantastic. That level of grit is really amazing. And the downside of that is that it's really hard to ask for help. And, so there's a lot of talk about stigma, and it is definitely, I think, one of the biggest obstacles that I've seen in terms of getting services from people, because there is growing public support and awareness that farmers and ranchers really face some very unique stressors and very unique challenges. I can't think of another occupation where you face so many things that are beyond your control and you're expected to juggle them well and keep figuring out how to keep going. Just the financial planning that has to go into adjusting to crop and seasonal preparations, and then all the things that could derail that. Like, that is a gamble most people don't have to face. And then if you tie on top of that the fact that you may be a three or four generation landholder, and you can't be the generation that's going to lose the land, like, that pressure it's simply not an option. So the public awareness and growing support, I think, has led to some really innovative services and ideas and concepts. And even amongst the best of them, it's really hard to get those in front of the people that need it. And I think, it's a really complicated issue in terms of the stigma piece, because on the one hand, there's a reluctance to talk about anything related to behavioral health. But there's also, in some ways, a very practical need not to be perceived as someone that could be struggling with some of that. If you think about just the competition for land, here on the mainland, the growing price of land and land leases is that there can be, within a 10-mile square radius, there can be tremendous competition to try to lease a certain plot of land. And if the competition involves one person that's worried about having their truck show up in front of the local community mental health building because they worry that will take them out of the running for competition, it's just simply not something they're going to risk doing. Mm-hmm. And so I think that sort of old pull yourself up by the bootstraps grit mentality, that's an aspect of it. Again, I think there's some really practical elements of it. And I think there's also a real need to just increase conversations and promote awareness. We know from research that one of the biggest predictors for help-seeking behavior in agricultural communities is prior awareness of behavioral health issues. So it seems to me that the best we can do is have conversations like what we're doing today and really kind of get the message out there that you don't have to struggle alone. And more so than that, the most important piece of equipment in any operation is that farmer and rancher. It is them and their family members. It's not the super expensive combine. It's not the latest tractor. It's not the center pivot. It's that individual and their ability to continue to sustain that practice and have good relationships around them. So I think changing that conversation and helping them understand that this ability to care for yourself and take care of your own thoughts and your emotions and your relationships is as crucial as maintaining your most expensive equipment. And I think we just have to keep talking and getting that message out there so that people understand that. Like Bob was describing, that engineering mindset and that problem solving mindset around you drive around, you're constantly scanning your crop and your herd for to promote its well-being. So, we talk sometimes about scanning for outliers. I need to identify those pockets of disease in my herd or crop that could potentially infect the whole, and find a way to mitigate that, contain it, make sure it doesn't spread. Well, the same process goes into how we monitor our own thoughts and the quality of our own relationships as well. And it's as important as those other elements in terms of crops and herd health as well. So I think, again, the more we can talk about it and make this okay and help people understand that you wouldn't slack on the maintenance for, $100,000 piece of equipment. So why would you slack on the maintenance for this equipment between our two ears? It's absolutely essential. You'll find ways to cobble together and keep your tractor running, through the planting season. But if you're not taking care of your stress and your well-being, it doesn't do you any good if you end up with panic attacks or heart disease or any of the number of, possible outcomes that can go with not managing our stress well.
Oh, well, thank you, Chad. You brought up a lot of interesting points that I think we can dive a little deeper in. Well, we do have lots, our Ohana, our family, is a big strength and cultural piece that we do capitalize on, and we hope, and which is why in our survey, we also included family members. We asked them in our needs assessment survey. So although we didn't get as many responses, we only have about, I forgot what's the number, 27. But so it's a small number, but of those, the indicators on stress, depression, and even suicidal thinking are higher than what's showing up among the ag producers. So for us, even though, again, it's a small number, and perhaps we'll have to really dive deeper and do the next step, maybe really target the family members to give them support. We didn't realize that this is what's coming out, that families are even more stressed and wanting more support than the primary ag producers themselves. So the fact that you brought up the issue of family, including the family in your workshop and reaching out to family members, very significant.
That's a good thing. That's really good thing. Chad and I have just discovered last month, we had a situation where Chad's been working with a voucher program with Farm Bureau, and one of the wives of a farmer went to get help with a behavioral health person. And apparently she improved so much that in time, her husband eventually went too. So the opportunity there for you, where you have so many, presumably women and children and.
Oh, no, we actually had about the same amount in terms of our family survey, male and female.
But if you have family members who are high stressed out, there's the opportunity to get them into help, and little by little you can get more reluctant people to get in too.
Yeah, that's excellent, Bob. And I want to go back though to what's happening in Colorado, just so our audience can understand. Do you know what percentage of farmers and ranchers in Colorado are experiencing stress, depression, and suicidal thinking? You have a pulse on that, because you got 36,000 is your population.
I don't know of any statistics that break it down that well. I'm familiar with a number of charts that rate based on like rural and frontier counties, which are based on populations. So obviously rural and frontier is going to be more likely where agriculture is going to be, although some of that also includes the mountain geography and just more sparse population there. But we can definitely see there's significant mental health provider shortages in all those counties. And one of the ratings that they look at is, in the last 30 days, have you felt concerned about your mental health or mental well-being? And all the more rural areas tend to score higher in those areas. So I couldn't tell you specifically about depression and things. I don't know of a good tracking model for that. But the assumption would be that, again, for looking at all those unique stressors that go into agriculture, sometimes the lack of social connections, all the elements are there to kind of ramp up some of those risk factors. And so I think it makes sense to operate from the assumption that there are increased risks for that. There's also probably an increased risk that if someone is depressed, it's been going on for a lot longer. If someone's a bit more savvy and exposed to some of this. And, mental health literacy, I think, is the term that's often used. So if there's a lot of mental health literacy, then sometimes people will, recognize my mood's really been down for the last 3 weeks. I better get in and do something. That trajectory for treatment is very different than someone that's been putting this off for a year and a half. And so I just think that, with those unique factors in our rural communities, it's worth assuming that we want to try to get as many safety nets in place as we can. And if you're familiar with Dr. Rosman at all, out of Iowa, he's kind of, I think in many ways considered sort of the godfather of agricultural psychology. At least I'd use that term. I think it's fitting. But he kind of looked at that typically it will be depression and anxiety are the two most common sort of diagnostic criteria that'll come into play for farmers and ranchers. Although I think he also talks about that relational issues tend to be one of the bigger things that maybe gets people in the door. And I think as you start looking at it, then substance use, and we've seen a lot of data that substance use has really increased during COVID as well, largely because, again, of that increased isolation. And so I think those are some of the sort of main clinical elements that we need to kind of be aware of and make sure there's supports in place for.
Yeah. So what would you say would be the main risk factors and protective factors in Colorado? For you guys, what are you noticing are the main?
Well, I think some of the risk factors is what Chad's been talking about with regard to the stigma, that we have a lot of men who have bought into the cowboy it up, be independent, be strong. And like Chad was saying, for me to park my pickup in front of the mental health center puts me at risk where I may not be able to buy some land if I want to buy another farm, because, Bob's pretty crazy. So we don't want to sell our land to him, I think those are some of the risk factors. The protective factors have to do with many of the families have some kind of a religious connection with their church. And they often get support from their priest, the minister, or rabbi that they have. That's one of the protective factors. Chad, do you want to add to that, risk and protective factors?
Yeah, I think some of the other risk factors would just be the social isolation, and for a lot of, I think, farmers and ranchers, it's such a solitary pursuit that you could spend all day on a tractor, and if you could just climbed up into that cab and you're not feeling all that strong in yourself mentally before you get in there. So if I have to spend, all day going back and forth disking or whatever I'm doing, and through the course of my own head in that entire time in that cab, I'm perseverating and going through some of my more anxious thoughts and my fears and my worries, and no one to help check me on that. I mean, the good thing about, a lot of other occupations, if you work in an office and you come in and you're in a noticeably bad mood, likely one of your coworkers is going to call you out on it. And you don't always have that luxury for this type of really sort of solitary work. So I think that can play an issue. And if I'm one of those guys that doesn't want to sit with those thoughts going through my head in the cab of my tractor all day, and I've got some whiskey in my thermos, there's also no one really to check me on that either. And so I think unfortunately, some of the downsides of that is that it can allow me to get into some pretty negative patterns and kind of give some fertilizer to some things that aren't really healthy for me. So I think that's a piece on top of the stigma, the cultural elements, the difficulty talking about these things because of how it's going to be perceived. And I think just the whole concepts of what behavioral health means and how to manage stress and anxiety. If we could look at it more from, again, the same sort of objective perspective that I would try to bring to crop or herd health, I think it becomes a different thing. And I don't think it's unique to farmers and ranchers. I think there's a lot of stigma around mental health, and the common tendency is to say, what's wrong with me? Right. As opposed to what's happened to me, what's happening, because in some ways it's no different in terms of what's going on with my thoughts than what's going on with my knee from years and years of trying to climb up into a skid steer or getting injured or getting knocked over by a cow or whatever it may be. Like, this type of work and these types of stressors take their tolls on bodies. That's part of why I think the Colorado AgrAbility project and the other states that have AgrAbility projects have been really successful in trying to help people with the physical accommodations part. It's a dangerous and risky profession and job. It takes its toll on bodies, and it definitely takes its toll on our thinking and our well-being as well. And so I just think all those things kind of combined together increase some of the risk factors. The protective factors is that as hard as it may be for me to ask for help, if my neighbor's asking for help, odds are I'm going to be there.
Another thing that Chad's developing is what he calls barbed wire thinking. And it gets at the CBT stuff. Chad, you want to tell her a little bit about what you're doing with that?
Yeah, we're developing a clinical model called Land Logic, and it incorporates action commitment therapy techniques and cognitive behavior therapy techniques. But really the entire impetus and overview of it is looking at the aerial photo or a bird's eye representation of someone's land or operation as, you know, that environment that someone exists in. And so for a lot of clinical practice, for something to have ecological validity, the entire point for me as a clinician is to know how that person operates in their environment. What are the factors that shape, stress, and reinforce them within their natural context? So if I just meet with someone in an office and just go through, you know, sort of normal clinical interviews, all I see is that person in my office. I don't get a sense of what are the things that strengthen them and, you know, beat them down in their own environment, so to speak. And so the idea of looking at someone in the context of their land and their operation, being able to understand that in terms of the values of both assessment and tailoring interventions to go back and hopefully help them have a different experience with their land and operation. That's one of the things we're working on now. So we've, I think we should have our first like formal trainings rolling out with that in April. I think we're collaborating with a group called Kansas Corn. It's got quite a number of providers within their network that have expressed some interest in doing that. But the hope in that is, you know, again, in terms of accessibility, acceptability, affordability, the hope in that is to equip therapists and social workers in rural areas to have clinical techniques, worksheets, and philosophies that hopefully are resonating with agricultural producers. And because, you know, in terms of stigma and scarcity and everything else we're talking about, the gravity that's upon a provider, if you finally get a farmer or rancher in front of you to start engaging in therapy, they start telling me about their stresses. I don't know anything about what agriculture is as a profession. I'm like, wow, it sounds like you need to take about a 2-week vacation. You know, the odds of them ever coming back for a second session it's next to nothing. And worse, if they're willing to talk about that with their friends and someone else says, I'm really stressed, I'm thinking about going over to that local clinic and maybe talking to someone, they're like, don't do it. They don't know, sick them from come here. And so, you know, we want to be able to have something that resonates with people and makes sense. I mean, really, if you think about it, all great clinical practices have had to be culturally adapted for the populations they serve. It doesn't mean that you change the overall process and approach, but it is really commonplace to use metaphors and recognize cultural values and incorporate terms and things that resonate with people that are unique to their communities. You know, the difference between working with someone, urban youth in downtown Denver versus youth in Greeley, there's very different cultural shifts there. And there's massive cultural shifts between produce growers over on the western slope versus corn producers in the eastern part of Colorado. So anyway, the whole idea is to come up with a clinical model. And as far as we know, it's really the first one that we can see that's been culturally adapted to support farmers and ranchers.
I think I mean, what you're saying sounds so resonant with what I would, you know, what I'm thinking too, this ecological validity and cultural relevance. I think that's huge. So if any of our providers here in Hawaii would like to be part of that training, how would we go about doing this? How would I connect them to your training?
By all means, email me.
Okay.
And we'll be glad to roll that out for y'all in any way that seems fit. And I'd be really curious to look at, you know, offering whatever sort of worksheets and practices and things we've developed, and then also looking at how can that be specifically tailored to the unique elements of your culture there on the islands, because any sort of, whether we're talking livestock or produce or whatever, your production is going to be different, and obviously your cultural values are going to be unique to your area. Yeah. And so the hope is that some of these things could be taken and still tailored to what's unique to your own individual area. And my hope would be, if we build something that's productive and could be valuable in that sense, by all means, I hope it does get changed and made more relevant to each setting that it's used in.
We want to thank Bob and Chad for sharing their observations from the field of behavioral health, the work being done in Colorado, and for discussing ways they assist ag producers address some physical, mental, and emotional aspects of ag production. Before we leave, though, I'd like to allow you to say anything, any remaining thoughts. We call it mana'o in Hawaii, like any ideas, perceptions, words of wisdom that you can like to share with our audience.
I'm very pleased with what's happening in Hawaii and across the country. I've been at it for 40 years, and to begin with, Mike Roseman and I felt like we were pretty alone in the country 40 years ago when we were doing some of these behavioral health programs. But now there's interest all over the country, and there are lots of professionals showing up with all kinds of resources and everything. It's an exciting time to be able to reduce stigma and provide farmers and ranchers with resilience enhancing information and workshops.
Well, you're a pioneer then, Bob. You've been doing this for 40 years. Thank you for your work.
You're welcome. Chad, some more closing thoughts?
Yeah. I would just like to say thank you. I think it's fascinating to me that you'd reach out to those of us in Colorado and look at, what might be similarities and differences there to what you guys have going on in the islands. And like I said, I love the work you're doing with the resource mapping. It's a huge inspiration. I'd love to get going with that here. And more than anything, I just want to thank you for your work out there in Hawaii to support your rural and your agricultural communities. So it's good for people to know that they're looked out for, and there's someone that cares, and there's champions for them. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for listening to the Seeds of Wellbeing Experts in the Field podcast, featuring the perspectives of service providers working to support ag producers in the Hawaii Islands, the United States, and beyond. If you found it helpful, please follow, like, and share this episode. If you have ideas about how we can make it better, please do let us know in the comments or use the link on our website.